Midnight on the Sasabe line is supposed to be the dead hour. Not quiet. The desert is never quiet. Not really, but dead. In the way a room goes dead when everyone in it is holding still. Nothing moves out there at the top of the night, except the wind coming down cold off the Babokivari range, and the occasional jackrabbit tripping a ground sensor, and lighting up my console with a false alarm I've learned to read and dismiss in half a second. I'd worked that stretch of wall for 9 years, and I could tell you the difference between a coyote dragging a line of migrants and an actual coyote, the four-legged kind, just by the rhythm of how the dust moved on the thermal scope. A man walking afraid moves one way, an animal moves another. After enough nights, your eyes stop seeing shapes and start reading intentions. So when the first flare went up at exactly midnight, burning that wrong color, not the orange of a distress round, not the white of an illumination flare, but a sick green, like something chemical and dying, like the inside of a glow stick that's been left out in the heat too long, then I knew before I even keyed my radio that this wasn't a crossing. Crossings have a grammar. This had none. It came up from the Mexican side, maybe 400 meters out. And it didn't arc the way a fired flare is supposed to. A flare is a thing thrown upward. You can see the lean in it, the curve where the launch angle and gravity argue with each other. This one went straight up, slow, like something underneath was pushing it, holding it, lifting it on a column of bad air. And in that green light, I saw the open desert south of the fence, laid out flat and pale and wrong. And the desert was full of people. And the people weren't walking the way people walk. My name is Russ Calloway. I'm 47 years old. And I spent the last decade of my life convinced the most dangerous thing along this border was another man with a rifle. I believed that the way you believe in gravity, without thinking about it, because every day confirmed it, I was wrong. I want you to remember that I said so right here at the start, because everything that comes after is the story of a man learning how wrong he was, 1 hour at a time. Before I take you any further into that night, I want to say something plain. Thank you to everyone who keeps coming back to these stories. And if this is your first time sitting with me, welcome. If this kind of grounded survival story is your thing, stay with the channel, leave a comment, let me know you're out there in the dark with me. It matters more than you'd think. Now, let me get back to that green light, because in the few seconds it took me to lower the binoculars and let my naked eyes adjust, the radio had already started to scream. It was Delfina Arenas on the net, Station 7, 2 miles east of me along the wall. She was the kind of agent who never raised her voice. 11 years in, ran her sector like a clock. The type who'd correct your grammar on the radio just to keep you sharp. Who'd tell you it's I copy and not copy that. Because precision is a habit you either have all the time or you don't have when it counts. I'd worked beside her on enough graveyard shifts to know the exact flat register of her transmissions. So when she came across the channel that night, I almost didn't recognize her, because the voice was high and tight and breaking on the consonants, the way a voice does when the person behind it is trying very hard not to let it do exactly that. Station 4, 4. Do you have eyes on the south approach? Do you have eyes? I had the handset to my mouth before she finished. Copy, 7. I've got eyes, I said. I've got Delfina. What am I looking at? There was a pause. Just static in the wind. That low desert hiss that fills any open channel out there. Then she said, very quietly, almost like she was talking to herself instead of into a microphone. They came through the Quito Baquito gap about 40 minutes ago. We thought it was a mass crossing. Big group, no rush, no runners. We were standing the line for a processing event. Garza went down to start counting them. And he didn't come back up. I want to explain the geography here because it matters for everything that came after. And because the men who write off stories like mine always start by getting the ground wrong. The wall along that part of Arizona isn't one continuous thing. People picture a single ribbon of steel running sea to sea. And it isn't that, not out here. It's segments. 30-foot steel bollards in some places, vertical posts, 4 inches apart, filled with concrete and rebar, topped with a flat anti-climb plate that turns the last 6 feet into a problem no man solves quietly. Then a gap where the terrain drops into a wash too deep and too unstable to build across. Then Normandy barriers. Those X-shaped steel rails welded into crosses and strung end to end across the low ground. The kind of thing that stops a vehicle cold, but that a determined man on foot can climb through if he's patient and doesn't mind the blood. My station, 4, sat on a rise overlooking one of the longest clean bollard runs in the sector. 2 solid miles of vertical steel, the good wall, the photogenic wall, the wall they put in the brochures. Behind me, to the north, ran the patrol road, graded dirt and then nothing. Creosote flats and Ocotillo and Bear Caliche for 11 miles until you hit the first hardball county route, Route 286. East of me, Delphina's Station 7 covered the Normandy section. That was the soft spot. That was the place where the engineering changed hands. Where a man with a cutting torch and an hour could make a hole. And where, on a bad night, the desert itself would do the cutting for you. And it was at the Normandy section, down in the gap, that the people were gathering. I swung the thermal back to the green-lit ground and started to count. On thermal at that range, they should have shown up as bright, human-shaped blooms, hot against the cool desert floor. They didn't. That was the first thing my mind snagged on and couldn't get free of. They showed up dim, cool, barely warmer than the rock around them, like bodies that had been out in the night air for hours, like meat losing its heat. I told myself the scope was acting up, that the green flare was washing the optics. I told myself a lot of things in those first 2 minutes. I stopped counting at 60 because they kept arriving from the south, out of the dark beyond the flare's reach, and because the ones in front had already reached the steel and were doing something I had no file for. They weren't climbing. They weren't cutting. They weren't milling around the way a real crowd does, shifting weight, looking back, talking. They had walked up to the Normandy barrier and pressed their faces against the metal, just stood there, with their cheeks and foreheads against the cold steel, like they wanted to push through it with their bodies. Like the wall was a thing they could lean past if they only believed in it hard enough. 7. They're not climbing, I said. I count 60 plus and they're not climbing. Why aren't they climbing? Because they don't know how anymore, Delphina said. I want to be honest about what I did next, because a lot of men tell these stories afterward and sand all the fear off them, so they sound calm and certain the whole way through. I wasn't calm. I sat down hard on the diamond plate step of my observation perch, felt the cold of the metal come through my trousers. And I made myself breathe 4 counts in, hold 4 counts out. The cadence they teach you for marksmanship, the one that's supposed to slow your heart enough to put a round where you mean to. And while I breathed, I tried to build a version of this night that let me stay the man I'd been at 11:59. A protest. People did stage them at the wall sometimes, candles and signs, but not at midnight, not silent, not pressed face first into the steel. A staged event, then cartel theater, a crowd hired to draw every agent in the sector to one spot so a load could run through somewhere else. That was the rational read. That was the read that let me keep doing my job by the book. I'd been trained for diversions. I knew the shape of a feint. Then the wind shifted. It had been coming down out of the north all night, dry and cold off the high ground. Now it swung, the way it does an hour or two past midnight, when the land starts giving back the day's heat. And it came up out of the south, across the wash and over the fence, and into my face. And it killed the rational Reed, stone dead. Because it carried a smell. It was the smell of a deer that's been down in a ditch for a week in August. That swollen, sweet, gas and meat smell that gets into the back of your throat and stays there. I knew that smell. Every man who works this country knows it. But a dead deer is one animal in one ditch. This was a wall of it, rolling up off the wash, and it was coming off 60 people who were standing up and breathing. I keyed the radio, and my voice didn't sound like mine. 7. What happened to Garza? The silence stretched long enough that I checked the channel light to make sure I hadn't lost her. Then, he's still down there, Russ. He's standing with them now. He walked down to count them, and somewhere in the middle of the group, he just stopped. And the next time I looked, he had his face against the rail, like the rest of them. I called his name on the loudspeaker, gave him the recall code, and he turned and looked right up at me, right at the booth. And his eyes were... She stopped. I heard her swallow, a dry click on the open channel. I locked the station. I'm in the booth. The door's steel, the glass is rated. I've been calling it up the chain since the first flare, but the relay at 3 points isn't acknowledging. That detail landed harder than the smell, harder than the eyes, harder than anything. The relay at 3 points was the repeater that pushed all our radio traffic north to sector headquarters in Tucson. Out here, with the mountains breaking line of sight. That relay was the difference between being part of an agency and being 2 people alone in the dark. If it wasn't acknowledging, one of 2 things was true. Either it was down failed, struck by lightning, eaten by a pack rat chewing a cable, which happens more than you'd believe. Or somebody up the chain had heard us and decided, for reasons of their own, not to answer. I'd been a government man long enough to know the second one happens more often than the first, and that the men, it happens to never see it coming. Have you tried a phone? I asked. No cell out here, you know that. Not a bar in 15 miles. The landline's dead, and not dead like a bad night, Russ. Dead like cut. No dial tone, nothing. I went to the locker for the sat phone and... She stopped again. And when she came back, her voice had a new quality in it. A thin edge of something past fear. The sound of a person who has just understood that the trouble is bigger than they thought. Somebody pulled the battery out of the sat phone. It's been gutted. The back cover's off and the battery's just gone, and there's a screwdriver on the floor of the booth. A Phillips head. It's not mine. Now I want you to sit with that the way I had to, alone on a steel perch with the smell of the dead in my mouth. 60 things that should not have been standing were standing at my wall. An agent I'd traded shifts with for years was down there among them, turned into one of them. The relay was silent. The landline was cut. And inside a locked steel booth, sometime in the hours before any of this began, a person had reached into the emergency satellite phone, the one piece of equipment specifically there for the night. Everything else failed and removed its heart, and left the tool behind. That wasn't infection. Infection doesn't carry a Phillips head screwdriver. That was a person who had known. Delphina, I said slowly, fighting to keep my own voice in the flat register she always used. When did you last see the sat phone working? Shift change. 6 p.m. We tested every shift change. You know we do. It's the one piece of gear we actually check. A long breath, ragged at the end. Garza signed for it. Garza tested it at 6 and signed the log and put it back in the locker. A silence. Oh God, Garza. I didn't have time to follow that thread to wherever it was leading her, because that was the moment the standing people at the Normandy barrier started to move. Let me tell you what they actually did. Slow, because the way it happened is the thing I still can't shake. The thing I see when I close my eyes. They didn't charge. They didn't claw at the steel or pile up against it. 60 of them, all at once, with no signal I could see and no sound I could hear, turned 90 degrees and began to walk not toward me, not away, but east, along the barrier, on the Mexican side, in a slow, shuffling column. They moved like a single thing wearing 60 bodies. One nerve had fired down the whole length of the crowd, and they all turned at once and started walking toward a single point. And the point they were walking toward was the welded seam where the Normandy steel met the end of the bollard run, the one structural junction in 2 miles where the engineering changed hands. The weak weld. I knew it was the weak weld. I knew it the way you know your own front step. I'd written it up in an incident report 8 months earlier. Marker E-14, junction of bollard cap and first Normandy rail. Weld showing fatigue cracking, joint flexes under lateral load, recommend reinforcement, and I'd been told, in a memo I could still see in my mind's eye. That reinforcement of the E14 junction was not in the current budget cycle and would be reevaluated in the next. 60 of them were walking with purpose in the dark toward the one place in the entire sector that I personally knew would fail. 7, I said. And my own voice had gone flat and strange even to me. They're moving east along the barrier. They're headed for the junction at marker E14. The bad weld. Delfina. How do they know about the weld? They don't know anything, she said, fast, like saying it fast would make it true. They can't know anything, Russ. Look at them. They don't even know how to climb a fence. But they did know, or something using them knew. And the only people alive who knew that the weld at E14 was the soft spot, the only ones were me, the contractor who'd read my report and shelved it, and whoever up the chain had pulled that report off the network and read what I wrote. I got down off the perch. My knees were stiff from sitting in the cold, and I felt every one of my 47 years in them as I climbed down to the truck. The F-150 was parked nose out on the patrol road, the way you always park it, the way they drill into you on day one so you can leave fast and so your headlights face the threat. In the lockbox bolted behind the bench seat, I had what every agent on that line had. My duty Glock 47 with 3 magazines, 17 rounds each, and the patrol carbine, an M4, with 4 30-round magazines. I did the math without meaning to, the way you breathe without meaning to. 127 rounds total, counting what was already in the pistol. I want you to hold on to that number, because over the next several hours, it became the only number that mattered. The number I came back to again and again, like a man checking his pockets for keys. 127 rounds. 60 of them already moving toward a hole that hadn't opened yet, and more coming out of the dark behind them every minute, dim, cool shapes filing up out of the south. Here's the thing about that number that they don't put in the training. I'd never fired my weapon on duty in 9 years, not once. I'd drawn it twice, once on a man who turned out to be reaching for a phone, once on a dog. I'd qualified every cycle, put thousands of rounds downrange on paper that never moved and never bled. And I was good. Genuinely good, the kind of shooter other agents asked for tips. But the thing they don't tell you about 127 rounds is how few that is when the target's number 60 and rising, and they don't fall down when you hit them in the chest. On paper, 127 rounds is a long afternoon. Against what was walking toward E14, it was a number I could already feel running out. I racked the M4 and chambered around. and the sound of that bolt slamming home in the desert quiet was the loudest thing I'd heard all night. Louder than the flare, louder than the radio. It echoed off the bollards and came back to me thin. "Delphina," I said into the handheld. "I'm going to E14. If that weld lets go, the whole column comes through into the wash and up onto the patrol road, and there's nothing between them and the highway but 11 miles of open ground. We cannot let it open. You can't go down there alone." Flat now, trying to be the clock again. "There's nobody else," I said. "The relay's dead. The phones are dead. Nobody's coming. It's you in a booth and me on a perch and a bad weld I should have made them fix." I swung up into the cab and set the carbine across my lap. "Stay in the booth. Keep that door locked. Keep working the chain. And Delphina, that screwdriver on your floor. Whoever pulled the battery wanted us cut off before any of this started. Which means it isn't an accident. And it isn't only out there in the wash. Some of it's inside the wire. Watch your six." I put the truck in gear and ran east along the patrol road with my lights off, navigating by the green glow that was already fading as the strange flare burned itself down toward the ground. And the last thing I heard before I put everything I had into the dark road in front of me was Delphina's voice. And what she said changed the temperature of my blood. "Russ." The chain just answered. A beat. "But it isn't Tucson." The voice said to confirm I was the agent at Station 7, and then it ordered me to evacuate north and abandon the wall. Another beat, longer. It used my first name. Standard protocol is badge number and station. Nobody in Tucson dispatch knows my first name. The patrol road runs straight as a stretched string for that whole eastern stretch. And I drove it at 50 with no lights, which is a stupid and dangerous thing to do on graded dirt at night. And I did it anyway because the alternative was letting that column reach the weld with no one standing in front of it. The truck threw a wall of dust up behind me that I could feel more than see. A dry grit settling on the back of my neck through the cracked window. To my right, on the Mexican side of the steel, the shuffling mass kept pace with me through the dark, a darker shape against the dark desert. A low, ragged line moving the same direction I moved. And I had the sick, certain understanding that they could hear my engine. Because every face in that column was turned toward the road as it went. Toward me. They tracked the sound of the living thing. E14 sat at the bottom of a shallow draw, where the land dipped and the road dropped across the wash before climbing the far side. I knew that piece of ground cold. The bollard wall came down off the rise in a long descending run of vertical steel, then ended in a heavy steel cap, capped and sealed. And from that cap, the Normandy barriers ran out across the soft sand of the wash bottom, the soft sand being the whole problem. Because sand shifts under a footing every monsoon, and the joint had been re-welded twice already by men working fast in the heat. The weld flexed. You could put your boot against it and lean and feel it give a quarter inch, feel the metal want to open. A quarter inch is nothing. A quarter inch is nothing at all, right up until 60 bodies lean on it at the same time. I stopped the truck 30 yards north of the junction on the high side of the draw, killed the engine, and got out with a carbine. The silence that rushed in after the engine died was its own kind of pressure, a weight that pressed on the ears. And then, into that silence, came the sound of them. And it was worse than the smell. It wasn't footsteps. The footsteps were soft, almost nothing. Sand under canvas shoes. What I heard was the breathing. 60 sets of lungs, all working wrong at once. A wet, rattling, bubbling sound, like men trying to breathe through soaked rags, in and out, never quite syncing up. So it never stopped. just rose and fell in waves. And underneath the rattle, every few seconds, a single, clear human moan would lift up out of the mass, a real human sound, full of something I didn't want to name. And then the rattle would swallow it again. I put the carbine to my shoulder, thumbed off the safety, and walked toward the wall. And the moan came again. And I understood that I was walking toward people who could still, somewhere down underneath, make a sound that meant something. In the last of the dying green light, I got my first close look at them. And I'm going to describe it once, plainly. And then I'll let it go. Because you need to understand what I was deciding to put rounds into. They had been people that morning. They wore the clothes of people who'd been traveling, a backpack cinched tight, layered shirts against the cold nights and the hot days, the cheap canvas slip-ons the smugglers sell by the case at the staging houses. But the skin had gone the gray of wet cement, of poured concrete that hasn't cured. And along the jaw and down the throat, it had split, not torn like a wound, but split, the way dried mud splits in a creek bed when the water's gone, in clean lines and angles. And out of the splits came a dark fluid that didn't run. It just sat there in the cracks and glistened, catching the green light, thick as roofing tar. The eyes were the worst of it. The eyes had clouded over with a film like the cataract on a 15-year-old dog. That blue-white milkiness, but they tracked. That was the thing my mind couldn't hold. Blind eyes that found me anyway, that turned and locked and followed me as I came down the slope, every head swiveling on a wrong-moving neck. And the column at the junction stopped pressing east and began, slowly, all together, to reorient toward the single point on the wall that was closest to the warm, living man walking down the draw. The first one reached the bad weld. It was a young man, or had been, maybe 20 years old, with a hiking pack still cinched high and tight to his shoulders, the way you'd carry it for a long walk, the straps cutting into the gray flesh. He put both hands flat against the Normandy rail, or right at the junction, fingers spread, palms to the steel. And he leaned. And the rest of them, reading some signal that passed through them without a sound, came up behind him and laid their hands and their bodies against the steel. And they all leaned together, 60 against one bad joint. And I heard the weld I'd written up 8 months ago begin to sing. That high, thin metal note, the sound a guardrail makes a half-second before a truck goes through it. The sound steel makes when it's about to stop being a barrier and start being shrapnel. I had 127 rounds and 1 weak point and 2 miles of fence, and the math arrived all at once and complete. I could not kill 60 of them one at a time before that weld let go. There wasn't time. There weren't enough rounds, even if there had been time. So I did the only thing that made any sense, the thing nobody trains you for because no one imagines you'll ever need it. I aimed not at the bodies, but at the joint, at the young man's hands, where they gripped the rail, at the exact inch of steel I needed to defend, and I started to fire. Controlled pairs. 2 rounds, reset. 2 rounds. The way I'd put 10,000 pairs into paper that never moved. The first pair took the young man through the chest, and the rounds punched through him and sparked bright off the steel rail behind, and he didn't fall. He didn't even flinch. He kept leaning, the dark fluid welling thicker from the new holes, his clouded eyes still locked on me. And I understood in that half-second, in my hands and my gut before my brain caught up. That center mass was a lie out here. That everything I'd ever practiced was built for a body that wanted to keep living. And these bodies didn't want anything I understood. So I shifted my point of aim up to the head, the thing every part of me had been resisting, because some animal piece of me still saw a 20-year-old kid with a backpack going somewhere, and I put the next pair into his skull. And that dropped him, folded him straight down off the rail like the strings had been cut. I want to talk to you about ammunition now, because this is where the night stopped being horror and turned into arithmetic. And arithmetic is so much worse. 6 rounds gone, 2 bodies down, 58 still up and more filing in from the south. And the column was now stacking 3 deep against the weld, and the steel was screaming continuously, that note climbing higher. I keyed the radio with my left hand while I fired with the carbine braced on the truck hood, the metal cold through my glove. 7, I'm in contact at E14. The weld's going. Body shots do not work, I say again. Body shots do not work. It's headshots only, and I do not have enough rounds. Do you copy? I do not have enough rounds for what's down here. Delphina came back fast and hard. Russ, get back in the truck. You can't hold it. You can't. The math doesn't work. Get back in the truck and come east, and I'll open the booth, and we run north together. And listen to me. That's the order I just refused from the fake chain, the order to abandon North. And I think the fake chain wanted us gone for a reason. They want the wall to open. Somebody wants this section to fail. And they tried to clear us out first so there'd be no witnesses and no report. So whatever you do not do what they want. Do not stand there and die at a weld that wants to break. She was right. I knew she was right while she was saying it. And I kept firing anyway, because the part of me that had patrolled that line for 9 years could not stand on the high side of the draw and watch a hole open in my wall. That's a flaw in a man. I'm telling you about it plainly because it cost me. And because if you've got the same flaw, you should know what it costs before the night comes when you find out. I dropped 4 more before the first magazine ran dry, everyone a headshot now, everyone a body folding down off the steel, and everyone buying a half-second of relief from that screaming weld. Then the bolt locked back, and the silence where the gunfire should have been was a physical thing, a hole punched in the night. And in that sudden silence, 60 clouded eyes found me at once. And the whole column abandoned the weld and turned, as one animal, toward the loud, warm thing on the high ground. I had a heartbeat to feel relief that they were off the weld. The next heartbeat, I understood what their turning meant. They were coming for me now. And the heartbeat after that, I understood the worst thing. The thing that should have been obvious from the start. The truck was 30 yards behind me. They were going to come around the wall to reach me. And they could come around because the bollard run ended right there at E14. And from the far end of the Normandy section, 200 yards east, there was a vehicle gate, an access gate, and nobody had closed it. Nobody had ever needed to close it, because in 9 years, nothing had ever wanted through it badly enough to find it. I dropped the empty mag, let it fall in the dirt, and slammed a fresh one home. 23 seconds of fumbling in the dark with cold hands that felt like 23 minutes. The bolt release under my thumb, the slap of the magazine seating, the bolt riding forward. 90-something rounds left. I couldn't do the count. My hands were doing the count for me. And a wall that no longer mattered, because the threat was already routing around it through a gate I could see standing open at the far end in the last green wash of light. And through that gate, the first of them was already shuffling out onto the patrol road, onto my side of the line. The wall had failed, not at the weld I'd reported, at the gate, at the one thing a budget couldn't be blamed for, the one thing that was just a man, some shift, some night, forgetting to turn a key. And then it came together in my head all at once. Standing there with the carbine hot in my hands and the muzzle smoke drifting flat across the draw. I'd been defending the wrong point all night. They were never trying to break through the steel. The steel was the trap. The column at the weld had been a magnet, a thing built to fix every agent's eyes on 2 miles of fence, while the real route, the open gate, stood unwatched in the dark. Somebody who knew this sector, knew the weld, knew the relay frequency, knew which gate would be open at midnight, and that I'd run to the weld. And not the gate. Somebody had built this whole thing, like a man laying out a snare. And the only people who knew this sector that well wore the same green uniform I did. I got in the truck. I'm not ashamed of it now, though I was for a while. I got in the truck, threw it in reverse, and backed hard up the patrol road away from the gate. And as I did, I finally turned the headlights on, because I needed to see, and there was no longer any point in being invisible to things that tracked me anyway. The high beam swept across the open ground to the north as I swung the wheel, and in the white light, I saw something that made me stand on the brake and stop dead in the road, the truck rocking on its springs. There was a vehicle already there, north of the wall, on the American side, parked on the patrol road, maybe 200 yards up the rise, sitting dark with no lights on. A white government Suburban, the model the supervisors drove, the model you saw at the sector office and almost never out on the line at night. And a man was standing beside it, in a Border Patrol field jacket, perfectly calm, his hands loose at his sides, watching the things come through the open gate. He wasn't running, he wasn't shooting, he wasn't keying a radio. He was just watching, the way a man watches a controlled burn, he said himself. And when my headlights hit him, he raised one hand, unhurried, to shade his eyes. And then he turned, deliberately, opened the driver's door, got in, and closed it. He didn't drive away. He just sat there in the dark cab, watching, like a man who'd come a long way to make sure a job got done right. I keyed the radio, my mouth dry as the road. 7. There's a supervisor's Suburban on the patrol road north of E14. White, no lights. There's a man standing by it in a field jacket, watching them come through the gate, and he's not lifting a finger. Do you have any supervisor logged onto this sector tonight? Anybody? Any visit? Any inspection? Anything? The pause that came back was different from all the others that night. It wasn't the pause of fear. It was the pause of someone doing math in their head that they badly didn't want the answer to. Russ, Delphina said, there's no supervisor on the schedule tonight. I made the schedule. I make it every week, and I made this one. The only people working this sector tonight are you, me, and Garza. Another pause, and I could hear her thinking it through out loud, slow. And Garza signed for the sat phone at 6 o'clock. And now Garza's down at the wall with his face in the steel, turned into one of them. Her voice dropped lower. So whose Suburban is that, Russ? I looked at the white truck sitting calm and patient in my headlights, while the dead came through the gate behind it. And the cold that went through me then had nothing to do with the desert night air coming in the window. Because I'd recognized the Suburban. Not the model, the truck itself. There was a dent in the left rear quarter panel, a deep crease with a paint scrape. And I knew that dent because I'd put it there myself, 18 months ago, backing into a Normandy barrier during a dust storm so thick I couldn't see the tailgate. The dent that got me written up, the dent on the truck that had been assigned to my own station, Station 4, for years, until it got reassigned up the chain after that write-up, sent north to somebody who outranked me. That was my old truck. Somebody up the chain had my old patrol truck parked on the patrol road at midnight, watching the wall fail, on a night when the relay had been killed, and the sat phone gutted, and a fake voice on the radio had used Delphina's first name to order us both to walk away. The dead were 30 yards behind me and closing. That low, ragged line coming around the end of the bollards. There was a man in my old truck 200 yards ahead who had built all of this and was sitting calm in a locked cab to watch it happen. The patrol road ran straight between us, open desert falling away on both sides into soft sand that would swallow a tire to the axle. I had 91 rounds, a full tank of gas, and a decision to make, and I want you to make it with me. Right now, in your head. There's a thing behind you that you cannot kill fast enough. There's a man ahead of you who arranged your death and is sitting calm in your old truck. The road is the only fast way out, and he's parked on it. What do you do? Tell me in the comments honestly, because I had maybe 4 seconds to decide, and I've wondered ever since whether the next thing I did was nerve or just panic wearing Nerve's jacket. I drove at him. I put the F-150 in drive and floored it up the patrol road, straight at the white Suburban. Engine roaring, dust boiling up red in my own taillights, because the way I figured it in those 4 seconds. Whatever that man was, he was still a man. And a man in a parked truck can be made to move. The dead don't bluff. People do. I needed the road, and I needed to see his face. Needed to know who had done this. And the only way to get both was to make him flinch first. He flinched. At the last possible second, the Suburban's headlights snapped on, blinding white, and it lurched forward and swung hard off the road into the creosote, bucking over the brush, and I blew past it doing 60 with maybe 4 feet to spare. For half a second, our windows lined up. His lit by his own dash glow, mine by the crossing wash of headlights. And I saw the face inside, and I knew it. It was Hollis Renner, Assistant Sector Chief, out of the Tucson office. The man whose signature was on the memo 8 months ago, telling me the weld at E14 wasn't in the budget. The man who'd taken my truck after the write-up and never given it back. The man whose name was at the bottom of every reassignment, every schedule override, every equipment requisition for 200 miles of border. He'd been the chain all along. He was always going to be the chain. And tonight, he'd come out in person, in my old truck, to watch. I got 200 yards up the road past him and stood on the brakes and looked in the mirror. The Suburban had stopped out in the creosote where it had swerved. And it wasn't following me. It was just sitting there, in the open desert, with its headlights burning 2 cones into the brush. And behind it, on the road, the column had come fully through the gate, now dozens of them, more than I could count, spreading out onto the American side under the cold stars. They were flowing up the road and into the desert. And Renner was sitting in his truck right in the middle of them, his lights on. And they were walking past him, around him, like he wasn't there. They didn't touch him. I want you to understand what that did to me, watching it in the mirror. I had just spent 6 rounds learning that these things abandoned a fence and routed through a gate and came for the first warm, living thing they could find me. And here was a living man sitting in a truck in the very middle of them, door surely unlocked, lights blazing like a beacon, and they parted around him like water around a stone in a creek. They knew him, or whatever moved them knew him. He was safe down there, safe in a way I understood I was never going to be again. The radio crackled. Delphina. Her voice had gone very quiet now, very controlled, the clock-running voice, the one she used when she'd stopped being afraid because she'd decided something instead. Russ, I've been listening to all of it. I pulled Renner's name into the system before the network dropped, his badge access log. He badged through the 3 Points relay station at 11:14 tonight. He was the last person inside that building before it went dark. He killed the relay himself, with his own card. I know, I said. I just looked him in the face. It's Renner. There's more. I heard her typing, fast, the keys loud and urgent in the booth. I'm into the equipment manifest now while I've still got backup power. Russ, 6 weeks ago, Renner personally signed for a shipment that came up through this sector. It was logged as biological remediation, agricultural. 40 drums, routed to a storage site 11 miles north of the wall, the old county pump house off Route 286. She stopped typing. The same 11 miles of open ground between us and the highway. The same ground that column is walking into right now. The pump house, 11 miles north. The exact ground the dead were spreading across, walking north and east, away from the wall, into the dark toward the highway, herded, I understood now. The realization landing cold and complete, herded by the one man they would not touch. He's driving them north, I said into the radio, slow, working it out as I said it. Delphina, he's not watching them fail the wall. The wall failing was the opening move. He's pushing them north toward the pump house and past it toward the highway. And he wants to know how far they'll travel and what they'll do when they reach people. And between here and that highway, there's no one. No one except... I didn't finish it. I didn't have to, because the same name had already landed in both our heads at once. 11 miles north, where the patrol road met Route 286, there was a county maintenance yard. And in that yard, every single night of the year, slept the only other human being for 15 miles in any direction. An old man named Eduardo Sosa, who'd run the water pumps for the county district for 30 years and lived in a single wide trailer beside the yard because the county was too cheap to pay him a wage that would let him live anywhere else. And he was too proud and too rooted to leave. Everybody on the line knew Sosa. He left jugs of cold water out on the fence post in summer, 3 or 4 of them, refilled every day. No note, no charge, just water for the agents working the worst heat in the country. He had no radio that reached anyone, no phone that worked out there, no idea that 40 drums of something had been sitting in his pump house for 6 weeks, and no idea that a column of the dead was walking up the road toward his trailer in the dark. The man in my old truck had 11 miles of open road and a head start, and at the end of those 11 miles was an old man asleep who had handed me cold water through the fence on the worst days of the worst summers of my working life. I'm going for Sosa, I said. Russ, that's exactly what Renner wants. Fast, urgent. Think about it. He wants to see what they do when they reach a person. If you drive up there, you're the person. You're the experiment. And so is Sosa. And you'll be feeding them a second variable to study. A breath. And if you go alone. Past Renner, past the whole column, with no backup, with not enough rounds, into the exact trial he set up. I know what I have, I said. 91 rounds. I counted. I put the truck back in gear and felt the wheel under my hands. Solid. The one solid thing left. Delphina, here's what I need. Stay in the booth. Keep that door locked. Keep working the chain. Keep your eyes on the system as long as the backup power holds. Because the second Renner figures out I'm running north to Sosa instead of east to you. He's going to do something to adjust. And I need to know what it is before it lands on me. You're my eyes. Right now, you're the only chain I trust. Russ. Her voice caught, just once and steadied. That fake voice on the radio earlier, the one that used my first name. Renner's the only other person out here. So that was him. He's been on this channel the whole night, listening to everything. He's listening to us right now. The radio went quiet. The desert went quiet. Just the hum of my own idling engine and the far thin rattle of breathing carried on the wind. And then a new voice came across the net. Calm, dry, unhurried, a man who sounded like he was leaning back in a comfortable chair with a cup of coffee. A man for whom none of this was an emergency. Agent Calloway, Russ. A pause, almost friendly. You always were the one who filed the reports nobody read. Diligent, thorough. Wrong about what mattered every time, but thorough. Another pause. Go home. There's nothing up that road but a sick old man and a long night. You can still turn around, drive east, pick up arenas, and be at the highway by 2 o'clock. I'll even radio you a clear lane, make sure the road's open the whole way. Or you can keep going north and find out what I already know, and not come back. Your choice. It's the first real one you've had in 9 years on this line. I keyed the mic, and I kept my voice as flat and dry as his, because I'd be damned if he'd hear it shake. You forgot to fix a weld 8 months ago because it wasn't in the budget. Tonight you spent God knows how much money turning 60 people into that and trucking 40 drums up to a county pump house. So which is it, Renner? Are you broke or are you rich? Because it can't be both. And a man who lies to me about his budget will lie to me about everything else. And I've stopped believing one word out of your mouth. The dry voice was quiet for a moment. When it came back, it was almost amused, almost warm. And that was the worst sound I heard all night. The weld was never about the budget, Russ. The weld was about you. I had your report. I had 8 months. I could have fixed it in an afternoon. I left it broken because I needed to know something about you before tonight, whether you'd stand and defend a thing you knew was broken, or whether you'd be smart and run. A pause. You stood. You stood at a weld you wrote up yourself, with a carbine and 100-some rounds, against 60 of them. That's all I needed to know about you. And now I know it. A click of breath. I'm telling the others now. The radio went dead. And out on the patrol road, 200 yards behind me, the entire column of the dead, which had been drifting north in a loose, ragged herd, spreading wide across the open ground, stopped moving all at once. The way they'd stopped at the wall. One nerve firing through dozens of bodies at the same instant. And then, together, slowly, every clouded face turned away from the highway, away from the pump house, away from the sleeping old man, and lined up on a single bearing. They turned to face north up the road, toward me. He'd aimed them at me, like a man aiming a hose, opening the nozzle, watching the stream find its mark. And in that moment, I finally understood the true nature of what I was looking at all night. These things didn't wander. They didn't hunt by smell or sound alone, not really. They went where the man in my old truck sent them, the way a herd goes where the dog drives it. And right now, he was sending dozens of them up 11 miles of open road behind a single living target to learn how far they'd chase and how many it would take and what would be left of the target when they finally ran it down. I wasn't a witness anymore. I'd never really been a witness. I was the test, and the test had just begun. I drove north. What else was there to do? East meant Delphina and the highway and a real chance at living. And a part of me, I won't lie to you. Not now. Not this far in, screamed to take it. To swing the wheel and run for the life that was still on the table. But east also meant leaving Sosa asleep 11 miles up a road with a herd of the dead being driven toward his trailer. And it meant trusting a clear lane, promised by the man who'd gutted the sat phone and killed the relay and built this whole night like a snare. I'd been a government man long enough to know exactly what a promise from Hollis Renner was worth. And the answer was nothing. Less than nothing. A promise from him was a thing designed to get you somewhere convenient to bury you. So I drove north, into the dark, with 91 rounds and a hurt at my back, and an old man asleep ahead of me. And I tried not to look too long at the eyes filling up my mirror. Here's the thing about driving away from things that never get tired. You can outrun them easy. A man in a truck doing 40 leaves them a quarter mile behind in a single minute. And they don't speed up. They can't. The shuffle is the shuffle. The problem isn't speed. The problem is that they never, ever stop. And you have to. You stop for gates. You stop for washes too soft to take its speed. You stop for an old man asleep in a trailer who won't come awake fast in the middle of the night. And every single time you stop, that quarter mile you bought comes walking back to you out of the dark, slow and patient and certain. Patient as rust working on a hinge. 4 miles up the road, I hit the first thing that made me stop. And it told me everything I needed to know about how far ahead of me Renner had planned this, how long he'd been laying it out. The patrol road crossed a cattle guard at a wide wash. Steel pipes set over a pit, the kind of crossing you slow for so you don't bottom out. And across the cattle guard, parked broadside, blocking the entire width of the road, was a county dump truck. Sosa's dump truck, I knew it. The faded county seal on the door, the gravel dust on the bed. It sat dead across the road with its hood up, and its keys gone, and all 6 tires slashed flat. Deliberate cuts in the sidewalls, the rubber sagged off the rims, into the dirt. And there was no way around it, because the wash dropped off steep on both sides of the road into soft, loose sand that would take my F-150 to the frame and hold it there like a fly in syrup. Renner had blocked this road hours ago, maybe days ago. He'd thought it all the way through. He'd known that if I didn't run east, I'd run north for Sosa. And he'd made sure that when I got to this exact spot, I'd have to get out of my truck and go the rest of the way on foot, with a herd closing behind me, across the last 7 miles of open ground, the way a man finishes a hunt on foot when the country gets too rough for the vehicle. I sat in the cab for a moment with the engine running and did the only math left to do. 7 miles on foot, the herd a quarter mile back and never stopping. A man's walking pace beats their shuffle, barely. But I could not walk 7 miles in the dark without stopping to rest. And they could shuffle 7 miles without ever once slowing down. Every time I stopped, the gap would close. Somewhere in those 7 miles, the arithmetic crossed over and they caught me. And the only question was, where? Or, I looked at the dump truck. Tires slashed, hood up, keys gone, but a dump truck rides high on a heavy frame. It's got a big diesel under that hood, and it's got a steel bed I could put between my back and whatever came up behind me. The keys were gone, but I'd hot-wired worse in a misspent youth a long way from this uniform. And a slashed tire still rolls on the bare rim for a few miles if you don't care what happens to the truck. And I did not care one bit what happened to that truck. Let me ask you something here. While I climbed up into Sosa's truck and got my multi-tool into the steering column, and the herd's first ranks came drifting into the far edge of my headlight's throw behind me, faces catching the light, eyes flat and milk white. If you'd reached that blocked road herd at your back, 7 miles to a sleeping man, a crippled truck, you might get running on rims if you were lucky. Or your own 2 legs you knew for a fact would fail you somewhere in the dark. Which one do you trust? The machine that might die under you, or the legs that definitely will? Tell me where you'd put your money. I put mine on the diesel. It took 4 minutes to get the dump truck running. 4 minutes of stripping insulation with my teeth and crossing wires by feel under the dash with my hands shaking. And 4 minutes is a very long time when you can hear the breathing getting closer with every wire. It caught on the 3rd try, the big diesel coughing black and then settling into a rough idle. And I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. And in the side mirror, I watched the first of them reach my abandoned F-150 30 feet back. They flowed around it without slowing, without even turning their heads, indifferent to the cold, dead metal. Because it wasn't warm, and it wasn't living, and the man in the other truck had told them what to want. And a parked F-150 wasn't it? I dropped the dump truck into gear and ran it deliberately off the road into the wash on the north side, down the soft sandbank, the heavy diesel chewing forward on momentum and 4 bad tires and 2 bare rims, the whole frame groaning, sand spraying, and it bogged for 1 terrible second at the bottom, and I buried the throttle, and it clawed up the far bank, the rear end slewing, the rims throwing sparks and gravel. And then it was up and back on the graded road. Slower now, lurching, the rims screaming on the dirt but rolling. Rolling north. And the herd fell behind into the wash. And Sosa was 3 miles closer than he'd been a minute ago. The handheld in my jacket crackled. I'd grabbed it off the seat of the F-150 before I ran. Delfina. Russ, you're still moving. I can hear an engine, but it's wrong. That's not your truck. What happened? Talk to me. Renner blocked the road 4 miles up with Sosa's dump truck, slashed the tires, took the keys. I'm driving the dump truck now, on the rims, north. It won't last long. Tell me what you're seeing in the system, fast, while I've still got you. A pause, and the clatter of keys. Power's almost gone in here. I'm down to the last of the backup. But before it drops Russ, I pulled the rest of that manifest. The 40 drums at the pump house. The label said biological remediation, agricultural. But I ran the supplier code, and it doesn't trace to any agricultural anything. It traces to a defense contractor. And the storage instructions on the manifest Russ. Listen, the storage instructions say, maintain below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Do not expose to open air. My hands went tight on the wheel. Say it plain, Delfina. I don't have time for careful. The pump house has refrigeration, industrial cooling. It's a water treatment plant. It's got compressors and chillers for the process. That's why he stored them there. That's why that building and no other. And Russ Sosa runs that refrigeration. Sosa's been minding those compressors for 6 weeks, keeping 40 drums of God knows what cold without ever knowing what they were or why they had to stay that way. I felt the bottom go out of the night. Keep going, all the way to the end of it. If the refrigeration fails, the drums warm up, and the manifest says do not expose to open air. There were 40 of them, Russ. There's only 1 drum's worth in those people tonight. 1, maybe less. That's all 60 bodies took. The pump house is 11 miles from the wall and 4 miles from the highway. And Sosa is asleep on top of 40 drums of the thing that turned 60 people into what's chasing you up that road. A ragged breath on the open channel. He doesn't just want to test it on the wall. The wall was the demonstration, the proof it works on a crowd. The pump house is the payload. If those drums go warm and open near a public highway. The radio cut to static, hard and final. The booth's backup power had failed. Delfina was gone, locked in a dark steel room 2 miles behind a herd, and I was alone again, in a dying truck, on a dark road, with a brand new and far larger understanding of what 11 miles north of the wall actually held. This was never about the wall. I'd been right about the gate and the weld and the magnet, but I'd been right small. The wall was the proof of concept, the field trial, the thing you do to confirm the weapon works before you deploy it. Renner had used my sector for 6 weeks as cold storage for 40 drums of something a defense contractor made. Run a single drum's worth through the gate tonight to prove it turned a crowd in the open. And the real event, the thing the whole night was driving toward. The reason for the relay and the sat phone, and the fake voice, and the slashed tires was the pump house refrigeration failing. Deliberately. Clean. With no fingerprints. 4 miles from a public highway, with an old man as the unwitting custodian, and me as the dead witness who'd be found among the bodies. The agent who'd abandoned his post, the man whose reports nobody ever read, and the way you make refrigeration fail in a remote county pump house. Clean, with nothing tying it to your hand, you cut the power. The same power that had run Delphina's booth. The same grid that fed the relay at 3 points. He hadn't killed that relay only to silence us. He'd killed it as the first step in bringing down the whole local circuit. And when the last of it dropped, the cooling in that pump house would drop with it. And 40 drums would begin, slowly in the desert dark, to warm. I had maybe an hour before the drums reached temperature, maybe less. I had 3 miles of road left on rims that were starting to come apart under me, the truck shuddering harder with every quarter mile, and I had 91 rounds and an old man asleep on top of a payload. The dump truck died 2 miles from the pump house. The rear rims had ground themselves down to nothing on the graded dirt. And the diesel finally threw a wheel a bang, a lurch, the back end dropping and digging in, and the truck plowed off the road into the bar ditch and would not move again, no matter what I did to the throttle. I left it. I took the M4 and the 3 remaining magazines, the Glock with its 3, the handheld, and the big 5-cell flashlight from the toolbox, and I taped the flashlight to the carbine's handguard with the roll of electrical tape every agent carries somewhere. Fast wraps in the dark. And I went the last 2 miles on foot at a steady jog, the pace you use when you can't afford to be fast and can't afford to be slow, only steady, only forward. And behind me, far back now but coming, I could see the herd crest the rise where the dump truck had died. Dozens of pairs of milk-white eyes catching one flash of my light before I killed it and ran north by the stars, by the black bulk of the mountains, by the memory of a road I'd driven 1,000 times. The pump house and Sosa's trailer sat together inside a fenced county yard, chain link with 3 strands of barbed wire leaning out at the top. One sodium vapor light burning orange over the gate. And as I came up on it, out of breath, my legs going to water, I saw that the sodium light was still on, still burning, which meant the power was still up, which meant the chillers were still running, which meant the drums were still cold, and the relief of that hit me so hard it nearly put me face down in the dirt right there at the fence. And then, as I stood there sucking air with my hands on my knees, the sodium light flickered, browned down to a dull red filament, came back, flickered again, longer this time. Somewhere up the line, in the dark, Hollis Renner was bringing the grid down by hand, switch by switch, and I had minutes, not an hour. The clock I'd been counting in my head was a lie. The real clock was that flickering orange light. I went over the fence, threw the carbine over first by its sling, got my boot in the chain link, hauled myself up and over the barbed wire, caught my jacket on a barb and tore free, dropped hard on the far side, and ran for the trailer. Sosa's single wide sat dark and small beside the squat concrete bulk of the pump house. I pounded on the thin aluminum door with the flat of my fist, the whole trailer shaking with it, and shouted his name into the dark. And for a long and terrible moment, there was nothing. And then a light came on inside, a yellow window, and the old man's voice came through the door, thick with sleep in Spanish, asking who in the name of God was at his door in the middle of the night. When he opened it and saw me, an agent he knew, soaked in sweat, chest heaving, holding a carbine with a flashlight taped crooked to the front of it, my eyes surely as wide and wild as the dead's were flat He didn't ask the foolish questions. He didn't ask if I was all right or what was wrong, or whether I'd been drinking. Eduardo Sosa had lived 70 years on this border. He'd seen men arrive at his door in the night, looking exactly the way I looked. And he knew that the time for questions and the time for moving were two different times, and that this was the second kind. He stepped back, let me in, and said in flat, unaccented English, the only thing that mattered. "How many? And how far?" 60, I said, gulping air. "Maybe more." I lost the count. 2 miles back, coming up the road. "Eduardo, they're not alive. They're sick, the kind of sick you can't fix, the kind that doesn't stop. And there are 40 drums of what made them sick sitting in your pump house, and the power's about to go. And when it goes, the drums get warm. And when they get warm, they open. We have to leave, right now, both of us." He looked at me for 1 full second. And I watched a 70-year-old man do, in that single second, the thing it takes most people an hour and an argument to do. He believed the impossible, all the way, because the man telling it to him had no earthly reason to lie, and every reason to wish it weren't true. Then he said, quiet and even, "My truck is gone. Renner's man came Tuesday and took it. Said it was for inspection." He knew the name. Of course he knew the name. Renner signed his paychecks too, signed off on his pension, owned a piece of his whole life on paper. "We have no vehicle. Mine's dead 2 miles back. We go on foot west off the road. There's a railroad grade, the old mine line. If we get to the grade, we can." The sodium light over the gate died. The trailer light died. Every light in the county yard went out at the same instant, all of it at once. And the only sound left in the sudden dark was the deep electric hum of the pump house. Refrigeration spinning down, the big compressors winding from their steady drone down through a falling pitch toward silence, the sound of cold leaving a building. And in that new dark, I heard Eduardo Sosa say a single quiet word in Spanish that I won't translate here. A word a man says when he understands he's run out of time. And I knew the clock had just hit 0 on the cold. Here's where the night made me choose. And I'm going to give you the choice exactly the way it came to me. Standing in that dead dark yard, with no cleaning it up afterward to make myself look better. I could run west into the desert with Sosa and leave 40 warming drums and a herd of 60 behind. And maybe live, and maybe in living, let a weapon reach a public highway 4 miles away by morning. Or I could go into that pump house, in the pitch dark, and try to do something, anything. About 40 drums I knew nothing about, with the cold already failing and the warmth already starting. And probably die in there, and probably drag Sosa down with me. But there was a third thing, and it came to me whole, the way the bad math at the weld had come to me whole. And it was the kind of idea that's either the smartest thing a man ever did, or the last thing he ever does. The drums needed cold, or they opened. The cold was gone, and I couldn't bring it back without the grid. But the manifest, Delphina had said, listed 2 conditions, not 1. Keep below 40 degrees, and do not expose to open air. 2 separate requirements. I'd lost the temperature for good, but the second condition, open air, that was a thing I might be able to control with no power at all. And it was the most desperate, most stupid, most stubbornly American idea I had. And it was the only one on the table. The pump house was a sealed concrete building, built to county code for a chemical store because a water plant handles chlorine and it has to. If the drums were going to warm and open, the worst thing in the entire world was for them to open in the open air, where the night wind coming down off the Babuquivaris would carry whatever came off them for 11 miles in every direction to the wall, to the highway, to Tucson beyond. But if they opened inside a sealed building, and the building stayed sealed, then whatever they put off stayed inside that concrete box, contained, not stopped, not cleaned up, not solved, but held. Held until someone with a hazmat team and a respirator and the actual weight of a real government, not one corrupt chief, could come and deal with it the right way. The pump house had heavy steel doors and no windows, built that way on purpose. I could seal it. I could shut every vent, jam the doors, and turn that concrete box into a vault around 40 drums. And then I could get Sosa and myself as far from it as the dark would let us go. And the thing Renner wanted open air, a public road, a body count, a demonstration the whole world would see, would not happen. Because the witness he'd written off, the man whose reports nobody read, would have done the one thing nobody bothered to read in those reports. He'd have followed the procedure the manifest itself laid out. Do not expose to open air. The procedure Renner had counted on no one out here knowing or caring enough to follow at the cost of their own neck. I told Sosa the plan in 10 seconds flat, fast and low in the dark. He didn't argue, didn't waste a breath on whether it would work. He knew that building better than any man alive, and he started filling in what I didn't know before I'd finished. The vents, he said. There are 4. 2 on the roof, 2 low on the east wall. The roof ones close from the inside. There's a chain on each. You pull and it drops the louver and there's a hook. The wall ones don't close. You have to cover them from outside. We had minutes. I could hear the herd now, close. The breathing coming up the road clear in the dead, quiet dark, a wet, ragged tide of it. And behind it, the soft sound of dozens of canvas shoes in the dirt. Sosa moved fast for an old man. He went into the pump house to chain the roof vents and to start the forklift. There was a forklift, propane-fed, he told me. He'd filled the tank Monday, and I went around the outside of the east wall in the dark, found the 2 low aluminum louvers by feel, and did the only thing I could with what was there. I stripped off my own jacket and stuffed it into one louver, packing it tight. And I pulled a sheet of plywood off Sosa's woodpile against the trailer and wedged it flat over both louvers. And I jammed it in place with a steel fence post driven hard into the dirt at an angle, leaning all my weight on it. Ugly, crude, the kind of fix you'd be ashamed to put in a report. Good enough for tonight. And the whole time I worked, I kept the flashlight dark and the carbine slung across my back, because light was the one certain thing that would bring them. And I could hear them finding the fence line now, the chain link beginning to rattle and groan somewhere off in the black. I got back around to the main door as Sosa brought the forklift forward inside the building. Its little propane engine putt-putting in the dark, headlights off. I helped him angle it against the inside of the steel door so that when the door was pulled shut, the forklift's raised mast would jam against it and hold it closed from the inside against any amount of pushing. But that meant one of us had to be inside the building to set the forklift and pull the door. And inside was where 40 drums sat warming in the dark. Inside was a place I was not at all sure a man should be breathing. "I'll set it," Sosa said, already climbing toward the forklift. "It's my building. I know where every inch of it is in the dark. I can set that mast blind." "No." I put a hand on his arm and stopped him. "You go west. You know the railroad grade. You lead the way. You're the one who gets us off this property alive." I set the forklift. I pull the door. Then I go out the side personnel hatch. There's a personnel hatch, isn't there? A code building like this, there's always a man door on another wall. He went still in the dark. I could just make out the shape of his face, the white of his hair. "There's a hatch," he said slowly. "On the north side. But Russ, listen to me now, because there's no time to say it twice. The hatch only opens from the inside. If you set the forklift against the main door and then go out the north hatch, the hatch swings shut behind you on its own spring. And it locks, and you cannot open it from outside. There's no handle, there's nothing. Once you're out, you're out. The building is sealed for good. There's no second try, no going back in for a thing you forgot. You set the door, you go out the hatch locks behind you, and that's the seal. Forever, until a man with a torch comes and cuts it open. That's the idea, I said. That's exactly the idea. That's the whole plan. And then the herd reached the fence. They came against the chain link the way they'd come against the wall, not climbing, not clawing, just leaning, pressing. Dozens of bodies laid up against the fence at once, and the chain link began to bow inward under the mass of them, the top rail groaning, the fabric of it singing that same high metal note I'd heard at the weld. The dead quiet dark was full of the wet, rattling breath now, close enough to feel. And underneath it the lonely human moan, rising and drowning, rising and drowning. Sosa pressed something into my hand in the dark, a flashlight, and a county handheld radio that didn't reach anyone. And then he was gone. An old man running west across the open yard toward the back fence and the black line of the railroad grade beyond it. Faster and surer than I'd have believed. A man crossing ground he'd crossed for 30 years. And I went into the pump house alone, into the concrete dark and the smell, the same smell from the wall, the deer in the ditch smell, but concentrated now, distilled, rolling off 40 warming drums in a sealed room, thick enough to stand in, thick enough to taste on the back of my tongue. I took one breath at the door and then held it, the way you do going underwater. I found the forklift by feel, by the warmth of its little engine, climbed up, worked the controls Sosa had left set, eased the mast tight against the steel of the main door until I felt it bite and hold. Then I killed the propane engine, because a running engine would eat the air I was trying to seal in. And the silence that fell when it died was absolute. Just my own held breath and the muffled pressing of the herd against the building's far wall. And then, in the total black, I climbed down off the forklift and started feeling my way along the cold concrete wall toward where a personnel hatch had to be, north side, the only way out of the vault I was building around myself. That's when I heard it, behind me, inside the sealed dark of the pump house, somewhere among the drums. Something moved. Not a drum settling, not the building ticking as it cooled. A footstep, a slow, dragging, wet footstep on the concrete floor. And then another, inside the room, with me, between me and the hatch. I had assumed the drums were sealed and the danger was still in the future, an hour off. A thing that hadn't happened yet. I had assumed wrong, the same way I'd assumed wrong all night long. Because one of those drums had already opened slowly, over 6 weeks. A hairline failure, a slow leak in a building no one ever inspected because the man who signed off on the inspections was the man who'd planted the drums. And there had been a person in this pump house. Somebody Renner had sent up here at some point to mind the storage, to read the temperatures. Maybe the very man who'd come tonight to cut the power by hand. Somebody who'd breathed the slow leak days ago and become the first of them. The prototype, the original. Locked in here in the dark with the source. Turning into the thing I'd been putting rounds into all night long. I turned on the flashlight. I had to. There was no choice left. And in the white beam, 6 feet away, standing square between me and the only door out of that sealed concrete box, was a man in a Border Patrol field jacket, the gray split skin, the dark fluid in the cracks of his throat, the clouded, milk-white, tracking eyes, already locked onto the light, onto me. And on the breast of the field jacket was a name tape, white letters on green, and the name tape said Garza, not the Garza at the wall. That had been a lie, or a confusion, or Renner's voice playing tricks down the radio, because here was Garza, the real one, the agent Delphina had sent down to count the crossing and who'd never come back up. Except he'd never been down at the wall at all. He'd been up here, in this pump house, for days, sent up here to mind the drums, and the drums had taken him, and Renner had let his own agent become the first test subject, the trial run, and then talked about Garza on the radio like he was still standing down at the Normandy line, to keep Delphina's attention pointed at the wall and away from the pump house, pointed the wrong way, like everything Renner did all night, like a man running a shell game with 3 cups and a whole sector of people watching the wrong cup. Garza came at me through the sealed dark, and I had a hatch behind him I had to reach, and a herd pressing the walls outside, and 40 warming drums in the room, and a carbine with 80-some rounds in it that would do me no good at all, because I could not fire a rifle in a sealed concrete room full of a thing that must not be exposed to open air. A muzzle flash, a ricochet off the concrete, a single stray round into a steel drum, any of it could rupture a container and end every reason I had come into this room. The one weapon I'd carried all night, the thing that had dropped them at the wall, was the one thing I absolutely could not use. So I didn't fire. I let the carbine drop on its sling against my chest, and I drew nothing. And I went at him with the heavy 5-cell flashlight gripped in my fist like a club. Because the only weapon I could use in that room was one that didn't make a hole or throw a spark. And I want to tell you that what happened next was a fight. But it wasn't, not really. Not the way the word means. It was 2 men in the dark, one of them already dead and not knowing it. The other one alive and terrified and out of every option but his hands. I hit him with the flashlight across the temple and he didn't feel it, didn't react, the light beam swinging wild across the drums and the ceiling. He got his hands into the front of my jacket, gripping, and the smell of him up close was the smell of the whole night made solid. And his strength was wrong too much and too even. No give to it, no fatigue, like a machine that didn't know it was supposed to tire. He bore me backward, step by step, and I let him, because every step back was a step toward where I needed to be. I let his weight drive me exactly where the hatch was. I'd marked it in the wild swing of the flashlight, a steel man door, north wall, a push bar on the inside. I let him push, and at the last second I planted my back foot and twisted hard with everything I had left, using his own forward weight against him. And I slammed his head into the steel hatch frame with a sound like a dropped melon, and his grip loosened for half a second. Half a second was all there was. I shoved past him, hit the push bar with both hands, and the hatch opened, and the cold, clean night air came pouring in over me like water. And I went out through it backward, dragging the carbine, falling onto the dirt of the north side, and Garza came through after me, half through, his torso out in the open air, his hands catching my ankle in a grip like a steel trap. And the hatch that only opened from inside, the hatch that swung shut on its own spring and locked, came down on him as it closed. I'll spare you the rest of that. It was loud, and it was brief, and the hatch sealed itself when it was done, locked for good from a side I was never going to be on again, exactly the way Sosa said it would. The building was sealed. 40 drums, and the thing that had been Garza, were inside it in the dark. And I was outside on the north side, in the cold night air, on my back in the dirt, shaking, with the carbine still slung across my chest and the flashlight gone, dropped somewhere, still burning inside the sealed room where no one would ever see it. The fence went down behind me as I got up and ran. I heard it go, the chain link folding, the top rail snapping, the herd pouring into the empty county yard. I didn't look back. I ran west the way Sosa had gone, found the back fence already trampled flat where he'd gone over it, and got up onto the railroad grade, that old raised berm of gravel where the long-dead mine railroad had run. A hard ridge above the soft desert, and I went north and west along it in the dark. And behind me, the herd flowed into the yard and found the sealed pump house and pressed up against the concrete, leaning on it, drawn to the drums and to Garza inside, dozens of them gathering against a building that would not open, no matter how they leaned. And that, in the end, is where I left them, not killed, not stopped, just contained, gathered around a sealed vault in the desert, leaning on the cold concrete, patient, drawn to a thing they could never reach, for as long as it took for someone with more than 91 rounds and a flashlight to come and deal with it properly. I caught Sosa a quarter mile up the grade, an old man sitting on the gravel catching his breath. And I got him up, and we went on together. Two figures on a dark ridge above the desert floor. The mountains a deeper black against the black sky, the stars hard and cold overhead the way they only get out there with every light for miles gone dead. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much to say that the night hadn't already said for us. We reached Route 286 at the gray edge of dawn, Sosa and I, 2 miles up the highway from where the dead were gathered around the sealed pump house. And we flagged down the first vehicle that came along, which happened to be a propane delivery truck running an early route. The driver took one look at the two of us, a sweat-soaked agent with a carbine and torn sleeves, an old man in his night clothes, both of us gray with dust and something worse, and he didn't ask a single question. He just reached over and opened the door. There are still good people out there. I want that in this story too. I used his CB radio and the new daylight and the open highway to do the one thing Renner had spent the entire night making sure I could never do. I got a clear signal out, to a real frequency, to people who weren't anywhere on Renner's chain. And I told them everything, fast and flat and complete, the way you make a report when it finally matters. The drums, the manifest, the supplier code that traced to a defense contractor, the sealed pump house, Hollis Renner's badge through the 3 points relay at 11:14, Garza inside the seal, and Delfina Arenas, locked in a steel booth at Station 7, alive, the only other living witness, the one who'd pulled the records before the power died. They found Delfina at noon, still in the booth, out of water, the door still locked from the inside, the gutted sat phone and the screwdriver right where she'd told me. Alive. They found Renner's Suburban, my old truck, with the dent I'd put in the quarter panel abandoned 40 miles north on a ranch road, driver's door standing open, the cab empty. They have not found Renner. I want to be honest with you about that, here near the end, because the stories that tie up clean are the ones that are lying to you. They have not found him. Somewhere out there are 39 more drums on a manifest with his signature at the bottom of every page. And the 41st thing I think about every single night, lying awake, is where those drums are now, and who's keeping them cold. The pump house is still sealed. There's a fence around the fence now, and a fence around that, and men in plain suits who don't answer questions, and a small story that ran once in the local paper about a contaminated water facility that nobody out here believed and nobody pushed on. The dead that gathered against that concrete were dealt with by people I never met, in a way I was never told and never asked about. And my reports for the first time in 9 years on that line were read. read very carefully indeed by people who made it perfectly clear that the reading was the end of it, and that the wall held that night, officially, and that nothing came through. The wall held. That's the line. And I let them have it, because Delphina is alive, and Sosa is alive, and the drums are cold again, and there are some fights a man wins by being the one whose paperwork nobody thought was worth killing. But I keep coming back to what Renner said on the radio, in that dry, calm, almost friendly voice, before he turned the herd around to face me up the road. He said the weld was never about the budget. The weld was about me. He'd needed to know if I'd stand and defend a thing I knew was broken, or be smart and run. And I stood. And that, he said, was all he needed to know about me. He was right that I'd stand. He was dead wrong about what it meant. He thought a man who stands is a fool. He can use a predictable man, a witness he can place at the scene and write off, a piece on the board that moves where you expect. But a man who stands at a broken weld with 127 rounds against 60 of the dead is not a man who's defending steel. He's a man who decided a long time ago, somewhere back before any of this, that he'd rather die at his post than drive past an old man asleep in the dark. Renner spent 6 weeks and 40 drums and a whole corrupt career learning that one thing about me. He could have saved himself the trouble and just read my reports. It was in there the whole time, in 8 months of write-ups about a weld that wasn't in the budget. I still work the line. People ask me why, after a night like that, and I tell them the truth, which is that somewhere out there are 39 drums, and one man who knows exactly where they are. And the only thing standing between those drums and a public road is people like me and Delphina people who read the manifest and turn the key and seal the door. The unglamorous procedure that nobody films and nobody thanks you for and nobody puts in a brochure. So if you've made it this far with me, all the way to the end, let me leave you with the one question I still can't set down. The one I'd genuinely like to know where you land on, because I've gone back and forth on it more nights than I can count. I sealed a man inside that building. Garza was an agent, a good one by every account I ever heard, before Renner sent him up to mind the drums and let the slow leak take him. I sealed him in the dark with the thing that killed him, and I locked a door I knew for a fact could never open again. I tell myself there was nothing left of Garza to save, that the man was gone days before I ever got to that pump house, that the seal saved a highway and a city, and maybe a great deal more than that. I tell myself that, and most nights I believe it. But you weren't in that dark room with the flashlight and the smell and the hatch coming down on a man's hands. So you tell me. In the comments, wherever you're listening from tonight, and I do mean that, tell me where you are, what city, what kind of night it is where you sit. Because it genuinely helps to know there are people out there in the lit-up living world while I'm telling you all this. You tell me whether I made the right call, whether the seal was a mercy or just the cleanest arithmetic, whether the wall held that night, or whether it only held because one man decided that a broken weld and a sleeping stranger were worth more than his own clear lane to the highway. I know which answer lets me sleep. I'm just not always sure it's the true one. The flare that went up at midnight burned the wrong color, green and slow, and pushed up from underneath by something I never did see. I've worked that line for 10 years now, a year past that night, and I've never seen another flare like it, not once. But every night at 12, out of a habit I can't seem to break and don't try very hard to, I look south toward the black shape of the Baboquivaris, and I wait, and I count my rounds in my head, 1 through 127, and I keep close to hand the key to no door at all. Because the wall held. That's the official line. And I'm the one who has to live in the gap between what's official and what's true. Stay sharp out there, whoever you are, wherever you're sitting tonight. Keep your tank full and your door locked and your reports honest, even when you're certain nobody will ever read them. Especially then, because one night the relay goes dark and the phones go quiet and a green flare goes up where no flare should be. And the only thing standing between the dark and the rest of the sleeping world is whether you fixed the weld when you had the chance, or whether you at least, when the hour finally came, decided to stand at the broken one anyway. I stood, for whatever it cost me, and it cost me plenty. And it's still costing, I stood.